And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever you are in the universe listening to us today. My name is Craig Guarente. I'm the CEO for Palisade Compliance. And today we are talking to my good friend, Stephen Dickens, Senior Analyst from Futurum Research. Stephen, how are you?
I'm good, Craig. Always a pleasure to chat to you. So thanks for having me on the show here.
You're very welcome. It's always a pleasure to hear what you have to say. And in honor of your presence here, I got you something.
Oh no, here we
I,
go.
I didn't show you this before, but I just want you to feel comfortable here. I got you a little
Oh, look at that.
solar powered Queen Elizabeth. We're going to put her next to my Volkswagen bus.
So she can wave at me all the way through. I love it. Thank you for that.
She will be doing that. Yes, yes. No, it's really great to have you on our little podcast here. I do appreciate your time. And when you and I first started talking about this, you went right to open source. Hey, we want to talk a little bit about open source.
Hmm.
But before we get into that topic, you and I met years ago while you worked at IBM, but I know you're now with Futurum. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're doing now and sort of your background, so everybody gets to hear that.
Yeah, so I've been at Futurum now since I think, what was it, June last year. As it says on the bottom of the screen here, I'm a senior analyst. I cover open source, enterprise technology, and fintech for our business. I also do some work to help grow the business overall. And really, I get to spend time looking at the market, understanding where the industry's going, the time that everybody else would like to have to go read things, get it briefed by organizations, and really go deep on particular topics and put the headphones in and spend 2 or 3 hours going deep on a subject, which we would all like to have the opportunity to do. But I'm blessed and lucky in my role that I get a chance to do that. And then the organizations that I work with spend the time to brief me and get their best experts on and permit me to ask questions, and then that ultimately leads in research and market commentary and things that we put into the market to inform buyers who are looking at these topics and really don't have the same opportunities that I do,
Mm-hmm.
but would like to sort of read some of that material. And so that can be commissioned research or organic research that we're putting out there into the market.
Yeah, I remember when you left IBM. First of all, you broke my heart. I was like, oh, Stephen's
You're
leaving.
too kind. You're too kind, Craig.
And then my second thing was, well, what the heck does an analyst do all day? What do you analyze? Right? I think I even asked you that the first time we spoke after you left. Like, what is it? What's an analyst day like? I feel like I'm opening up the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and I'm analyzing things. But some of the stuff that you guys have published and put out there has been really good. You also do a little podcast that you have called the Mainframe Podcast.
Yeah, I do a couple of different podcasts. I do one for the Linux Foundation, for one of their collaborative projects, the Open Mainframe Project, which I had the pleasure of setting up when I was at IBM. They've got a podcast show, and I've also do one with another dear friend of mine, Jared Clay, on the makings of money and fintech and cryptocurrency, which is an interesting emerging space, but sort of love topic for me. So I get to talk to Jared, who's a lot smarter than I am every week, and dig into that topic. So yeah, I do like the occasional podcast, Craig.
I know you do. And actually, the Mainframe Podcast, I will tell you, is literally the only podcast I listen to. I'm not a
Oh, okay.
podcast guy. So
Fantastic. Oh, I'm glad to hear that.
you have 100% of the Palisade podcast audience
Excellent, excellent. I'm glad
right
to hear
there.
that.
Well, I think from this little back and forth, folks can see that you've got tons of different experience in different areas, and I think if I was hiring an analyst, that's what I would be looking for: someone who's got sort of that broad background. And we are streaming here on LinkedIn, so if folks have questions, they can always feed them into the chat there, and then Stephen and I can answer them. But Stephen, since we're focusing on open source, last week we did a podcast with Ed Boyajian, the CEO of Enterprise DB, and he was
Hmm.
talking to me about sort of the explosion of Postgres and that whole movement. But can you give our audience here sort of just a big picture, like how pervasive is open source technology into what we do every day?
Well, I think the move to open source has really found its way into the enterprise over the last probably most recently probably the last 5 years, but probably over the last 10 years. If you look at Linux as an operating system, it's celebrated its 30th birthday. That's the sort of biggest part of the open source community. That really started out as the kind of hobbyist, an alternative desktop implementation as an alternative to Windows. And then from that point, it's crept closer and closer to the enterprise. And then what you've seen with people like Enterprise DB and the team at Fujitsu with what they're doing with Enterprise Postgres, MongoDB, those in the database space, all the work that's going on within the Container Native Compute Foundation, the CNCF, around Kubernetes and orchestration there. We're starting to see it become more and more mainstream in the enterprise space. So I think, if you look at that maybe 30-year history of sort of Linux and open source, probably only that last 5 to 10 years. But what we've seen is, and this is one data point that I think backs it up, you would think on Microsoft's Azure cloud platform, the predominant operating system would be Windows. That wouldn't be a hard sort of assumption to make. It's Microsoft's cloud platform. Microsoft invented Windows. There's going to be more Windows on Azure than anything else. But you'd actually be wrong. There's more Linux on Microsoft Azure than there is Windows. And I think I always carry that one around with me. I was at a Microsoft presentation and they mentioned that at an open source conference. That to me tells you all you need to know about the adoption of this. I haven't tracked that metric since, the percentage split, but I think that tells you how much of this is now being deployed in the enterprise. And that's deployed, but also embedded. So, if you're using a set-top box or a screen in the back of a seat in an airplane or IoT devices, the operating system for those is going to be Linux-based and open sourced. So, we're seeing a lot of the telco networks with what's going with open radio access networks, ORAN. Previously I spent some time in that space sort of 15, 20 years ago. It was a very closed set of networks based on Nokia and Ericsson. We're now seeing open source in that space and people really opening up. So I think that the adoption of open source is getting to the point where it's pervasive. And I think that's changing the landscape around how you think about software licensing, how you think about where code comes from, whether it comes from companies, whether it comes from communities. I think those are some of the dynamics I know we're going to talk about, but I think as the adoption curve has changed, some of the challenges have changed. And I say challenges, I don't mean that in a negative sense. I think it's just some of the things you've got to start thinking about.
First of all, that's an amazing statistic. If Microsoft's cloud, there's more users of Linux than Microsoft, whether it's true or not. I mean, meaning that it's close, even if it's 60-40, you would think it'd be 90%, 10%, right?
And that was where my mind was. You'd think that most people would be running Windows on Microsoft's cloud. But that's not the case.
Being of a certain age, I remember when Linux came out and it was a big threat to Microsoft. And I remember there was a war on Linux in Microsoft because it had to be Windows everywhere. Looking at Microsoft, and this is probably not a question you and I can answer, but looking at sort of their strategy now, do they even care that there's more Linux than, because they're about the Azure cloud revenue, and as long as you're using their platform, whether using Linux or Windows, probably, I mean, I'm sure they would love you to use Windows, but if you're going to use Linux, why not?
I think they've moved further up the stack. I mean, obviously they're not going to turn that Windows operating system revenue stream off, and they're certainly not keen to do that. But I think they've moved up the stack and into different parts of the solution. So I think it's probably a lot less interesting than it was when Bill Gates was there and running that business.
Right. I'm going to have him on next month's webinar and see.
You can ask him directly.
I'll ask him directly. So, going back to sort of that first iteration or early open source technology, the Linux versus Windows thing, thinking back, I remember the big driver for that was price.
Mm-hmm.
Linux is free, Windows isn't. Let's use something that's free. It does just enough of what we want to do. I remember those conversations clearly, and sort of that sort of thinking. What else besides price? What else drives people to open source?
I
Why use an
think
open source versus a
so.
proprietary?
Let's talk about price first. Yes, a lot of the open source is free, but there is a challenge with free. And so let me talk about what they call the freemium model for open source. What you'll find is a community version of a product and then an enterprise supported version of a product. So OpenSUSE and SUSE from an operator and SUSE's Linux enterprise server SLAES as just an example. You can think of the same with Fedora and RHEL from a Red Hat perspective. So there's stuff out there that you can download and get access to and just use for free without having to pay anybody and use the community version. That's probably the cleanest phrase.
Mhm.
But then when something breaks in the middle of the night, you're relying on that community to answer your support call. And you may put a message into the community and somebody may find it and respond to it within 3 minutes, or it might take 3 months or 3 years. You also don't know that your specific configuration has been tested and certified, and there's not a support roadmap. So typically, the difference between a community version and an enterprise version is you're paying for a subscription and support. You're paying for a packaged version of that open source product that's been tested, that's got a support lifecycle, and you're paying for somebody to be able to pick up that phone and answer the call if it goes bump in the middle of the night, typically with an agreed upon either 9x5 or 24x7 SLA, depending on which level of subscription and support package you've paid for. So I think the first piece to say is open source doesn't equal free.
Mm-hmm.
It can equal free, but I think if you're a big bank and you're running mission critical computing platforms on top of open source, and a lot of them do, you're going to want a support contract because you want to make sure that if it goes bump in the middle of the night, there's somebody there to help you.
Right. You don't want to rely on the message forum for some
Yeah,
random
yeah. I
guy
mean,
in wherever he is or she
yeah. I
is
mean,
to answer your
that
question.
person in the Far East might be doing a great job of giving you a support ticket, and there might be some great insight that they can share, but you don't know who's giving you that feedback.
Sure.
Are you going to roll that straight into production? Probably not. Some of those hot fixes, have they been tested? Do they break anything else when you roll them in? That testing and certification process and the support is really what you're paying for. So then the sort of so let's park the sort of open source is free for a moment. Then while you're looking at open source versus an enterprise version, are you looking at Oracle versus Postgres as an example, or looking at a Unix operating system from IBM versus SUSE from an operating system perspective? And I think what fundamentally you're tapping into is the power of the crowd. And let me explain what I mean by that, which is open source by its very definition is crowdsourced code. A community will build around that code base, and then there's a vibrancy of code being submitted and speed of which that code is developed. You can tap into an organization of people which is broader than the boundaries of just one company. So let's stay on a Unix operating system from somebody like an Oracle or somebody like an IBM. IBM develops its Unix platform for the Power systems. They've got a bunch of fantastic developers, thousands of them probably, but they all work for IBM and they all develop that operating system, AIX. If you look at something like Linux, you're tapping into thousands and thousands of developers that work for multiple organizations and have got different um, backgrounds and experiences and different things that they bring to the melting pot. And those all coalesce into an open source version of the database. Then organizations go and take a snap of that, and then they'll go and turn that operating system ultimately into an enterprise version. So I think the fundamental thing you've got to get your head around is the power of the crowd and the power of this crowdsourcing of software. That's a very powerful dynamic that the open source companies and projects would argue leads to better quality code.
And would you say the crowd is really larger companies that are sort of, like you mentioned, IBM with AIX and sort of different versions? I mean, how much of it is actual people like you and I just sitting there thinking about new code and sort of developing it and enhancing what's in these various tools that are out there? I mean, has it sort of been co-opted by larger companies, right? Say, we had this movement of Linux, which started with like a few people, and now it's sort of, there's Red Hat, there's Oracle, there's all this stuff that sort of, it's sort of the big companies have taken it over to create another subscription model for themselves.
Well, this
is not a bad thing, by the way. It's just the evolution of the market.
Well, I think the Linux Foundation plays a really interesting role here as that kind of independent arbiter. The project that I'm involved with has got 3 or 4 big competitors in it that all contribute to common code bases. And I think that's the dynamic of where the Linux Foundation's almost able to play the role of the United Nations or Switzerland to be able to get people who typically don't play nice together to play nice with each other to advance code. So you look at the Linux kernel, for instance, that's a project hosted by the Linux Foundation. You look at Kubernetes, that's under CNCF as a collaborative project. There may be code contributions there from Amazon and from Google and from Microsoft and from Red Hat and from SUSE, all of which want to compete for your enterprise Kubernetes business, but are all of very active members of CNCF and who commit code to the underlying Kubernetes base. So I think it's multifaceted of how, so you would think there was enterprise type software competition going on, but then there's also developers pulling together in a community without some of those commercial and enterprise oversight. And that really is the Linux Foundation call it collaborative projects. And I think that's exactly the right phrase for it, because they are truly competitors collaborating on code.
Right. So I think the idea, obviously open source is not going away. It's not something that can be bought out in terms of, when we've seen this, in our little world, we deal with Oracle, and there's sort of they have an Oracle Linux version. They bought Sun with Java. They have MySQL. I'm waiting for them to move more into the Postgres, like who they're going to buy next to sort of co-opt that competition. But when I was doing a little bit of research on the history of MySQL, which was owned at one time by Sun, and that's how Oracle got a hold of it. Of course, I go to the source of all truth. I go to Wikipedia, and the litigation around the licensing and who owns things, it went from group to group, and this group is suing that group, and that group is suing this group. So is that a concern? Ownership, IP, and when you're using these open source products, like it's easy, I have a Mac, I know who created Mac OS. It's sort of, don't have to worry about it. If I'm using a Linux or I'm using something else, is there a concern that you might not have the right license, or there might be some litigation, or that company that you're dealing with might not be there in 6 months?
I think you've got to look at this in the most balanced of way. I think, yes, some of those are valid concerns, but you've got to look at them through the lens of there's going to be some trade-offs. typically classic enterprise software, which I know you know better than I do, is going to have a price point and going to have some restrictions on it. And if you flip and go the other way and look at the price point of open source, it's going to have a different set of licensing terms and a different set of restrictions. One of those isn't bad and one of those isn't good. They're just different. So one of the things, and I got briefed on this recently by Red Hat, and I know the Linux Foundation do this as well, is I'm starting to see organizations set up an open source program office. And that open source program office is really designed fundamentally for two different things. First off, how your developers who work for you contribute to open source communities, because I think you've got to be aware of that, and I'll double click on that in a moment. But then there's also, what does that mean from a licensing point of view? So let's maybe cover that first. There's open source licensing models. Eclipse Foundation have got one. There's I'm trying to remember the acronyms frantically here, but there's a couple of different models.
There's a few of them, yes.
A couple of big models in the open source community, I think. And then you've got to look at what happens once you go from that kind of open source license then to the freemium version. Typically, what happens with a lot of products that get built on open source, it may be the combination of 2 or 3 different open source projects that get built and kind of mashed together to form an ultimate product that you're buying. So I don't think that's a problem. You've just got to be aware of it. So if you're the software license compliance manager for a big bank or a telco or a retailer, as you say, you used to have a relationship with IBM and with Oracle and with multiple other software companies with Microsoft, and you knew, I buy Microsoft products from Microsoft, I buy them under my master software agreement, I know where the T's and C's are, everything's all in one place. Whether it's under control or not is where you come and earn your money, but there's a direct line of sight from the product to the license. I think with open source, that dynamic's changed. So you've got to start to think through what that means and the implications of what that means.
Yeah, and you and I spoke the other day about sort of this open source compliance office, let's say, that, and I went back to my team because every company, even though we're probably known as a little professional services organization, but we've got technology embedded in everything we do. Like every engagement with the clients, it's running on technology. We're analyzing data. We built our own tools. Hey guys, what open source do we have in there? How are we? Just to make sure that the things that we're using as we build and grow our business and monetize certain things that we're doing, that we're okay, right? We've got compliance in our name. It would be really bad if we were found out of compliance, for using some open source in a way. And as you mentioned, there's so many different open source licenses and sort of different ways that you can use things, which sort of brings me to Java. Used to be owned by Sun. Oracle buys Sun, and for years it sort of sat dormant, right? Where dormant from a monetization standpoint of Oracle. They just and now these are not my words, but I had a customer who a couple of years ago said, Craig, this Java is the cockroach of the internet. It just goes everywhere. And so they were trying to figure out their compliance position. But what you just said before is definitely true in Java. When we are engaged with a client and they want to know their Java position, well, that's very different than a database. Like with database, the first thing we say is send us your contracts. Let's see what you're licensed for. And then we get into all the, how are you using it? Who's using it? Why are you using it? Like all that fun stuff. With Java, there are no contracts. There's nothing. Right? It's embedded in that product and it's embedded in this product. And so we've got to go find the Java first. So we start with the technical and then we go look for the agreements. Like, okay, so now we see all this Java. Now where are the licenses, right? So you have to dig for it. And I think it's really important, and now Java is just one example, but I'm sure every other open source is the same thing. Or has elements of that, is you really need to stay on top of that. Like you think you buy this application and Java's embedded in it. Well, now Oracle charges for Java, and Oracle's not going to go after that other party. They're going to come after you because you're the one using Java. So they've taken something that everybody thought was free, and they're probably generating $1 billion a year off of it. I mean, they've probably paid for the Sun acquisition just in Java licensing in the last few years, which is brilliant on them. And it sort of worries me that what else is out there? Where are the time bombs? Where are the, how people got so used to open source and thinking it was free. All of a sudden, Oracle said, well, that version's free, but if you want an update, you got to do this thing over here. You got to pay us money.
Well, I think you said the key word, and this is what I would sort of be counseling people towards. Embedded is the key word. What is embedded in the things that you use? What's the downstream dependencies on those projects? And ultimately, having a view of how you interact with those communities and projects so that you know what those downstream dependencies are. So if you're using the ELK stack in some analytics product, that's fine. A lot of people use the ELK stack, Elastic, Logstash, and Kibana. It's a classic sort of stack of open source. The LAMP stack would be another one. What is your view of stretching past the product you're using to understand what's going on with those communities? And that's a key role of an open source project office, is to be understanding how you're going to interact with those downstream communities. So there'll be an Elastic community that you should be thinking, I'm a user of this product. It uses the ELK stack built within it. How do I go and at least be aware of the Elastic community, what's happening in that community, and be aware of my dependencies? Mm-hmm. If I'm using something that's absolutely critical to the operations of my business, I can't just go and think about the end product I'm buying like maybe you could before. You've got to have one eye to the community. And that's not to say that's a problem. It's just something you should be thinking about.
One of the things I see with open source, it offers a flexibility that maybe not be there with proprietary software. And what I mean with that, and I'm just going to, because again, my world is all about Oracle, so I'm just going to focus on Java and compare that to their database product. If a company is using Oracle database and for whatever reason they want to move to Postgres or something else, there's all these tie-ins. You're running eBusiness Suite or you're running PeopleSoft, and the license agreement forces you to use the Oracle database. So it's really hard from a licensing perspective to move off of the Oracle database. So Oracle can squeeze their customers, and again, I'm not saying this in a pejorative way. They can push their customers a lot further into paying additional fees and sort of doing things. And for Java, though, they really can't, right? If they push their customers too hard, they'll just go to an alternative open source. Like it's not like it's super easy and you can just press a button and move to this non-Oracle version of Java, but it's a lot easier than, because I think the licensing, you can use a non-Oracle version of Java very easily for most of your implementations. So I think, when I said before that Oracle was sort of laying low for a few years and letting Java percolate after they bought Sun, they were probably trying to figure out, like, how much can we push our customers? Because if we push too hard, they'll just leave Oracle Java and they'll go to Azul Java or IBM Java or some other version of Java that is, they don't have to deal with all the other nonsense then.
Well, and that goes back to what I said earlier around where you add value in the stack. You're not adding value for the underlying intellectual property like you were in a proprietary software model. You're adding value around the support contracts, the testing, the integration testing, the does it go bump in the middle of the night support. So, I mean, maybe not wishing to not knock Oracle, but what they're looking to do here is add that value around Java and go, this is authorized, supported Java. We know it works. It's been tested with this product and that product. And, the Oracle team will have done a lot of work, maybe the underlying intellectual property is not what you're thinking about or shouldn't be thinking about. You're thinking of paying for somebody to support that intellectual property. So, and this is kind of fundamental with open source. There's not, and always used to catch people, you don't buy an open source license. There's no such thing as an open source license for Red Hat or for SUSE or for Postgres. You're buying a subscription and support contract.
Yep.
And I think that's the fundamental thing you've got to get your head around. And I know you didn't know this, Craig, but speaking to the listeners here, you've got to get your head around you're not licensing intellectual property.
That's true.
When you're paying that money to an enterprise open source company.
So it's a different, like you said, people think about buying a license, but it's buying a subscription. Same thing we see in the move to the cloud, where people think they have these assets, and you're really just renting time on somebody's server somewhere, right? And they could just stop it at any point, like if you don't keep paying them the money. So with an on-premise sort of more traditional license, you actually own the license and you could keep that and use it. But these are very different models.
And I say that not because they're bad,
right?
And one is, but they're just different, and you've got to think about it differently. You've got to go into it with a different mindset. Your traditional software procurement person has got to think about their job differently, not because the previous model was bad and this is good. They're just different.
They are different, and even a professional services company, we're always trying to think, how can I take this revenue and make it recurring and make it an annuity and sort of, tap into that market. Years ago, I think we've been doing this now for 11 years, Palisade, we've been in business. And I remember people telling me, when you're going to have cloud, you're going to have open source, everything's going to become so easy, you're just going to go out of business. Like, you've got 2 or 3 years. Well, I think the opposite's going to happen. And it's just going to get more complicated, right? Not that it's worse. There's just more options, right? When you have more options, like if you can, like I have a phone and it's an Apple phone and there's one, or you can have 25 Android phones and you just have to choose and how you want to configure it. So it's just more complex, which again, to your point, is not necessarily bad, but we do have some questions in from the audience here. So I figured I would go through a couple of them. Some guy named Terry Ginther, he thinks we look great.
He's a troublemaker. I'd be worried about him, Craig.
Watch him closely, everybody. Do you see Oracle fighting or embracing open source in general, Cloud of Customer? They've got Enterprise Linux and they've got MySQL or MySQL, depending how you want to pronounce that. And I think, at least my view, and let's move away from Oracle for a second. I think all of these larger companies are embracing, have these proprietary sort of closed source applications or platforms. You brought up a great one with Microsoft, and they've embraced open source. Oracle has embraced many versions of open source. MySQL and Java are 2 of them. Now, they have an interesting way of doing it, but it's not like they're trying to shut them down, right? They've enhanced them, they've promoted them. And like any big company, they're trying to monetize them, right? I'm thinking what you said about Microsoft. Are you seeing any companies that are sort of anti-open source and trying to squash it?
I'm not seeing anybody that's openly anti and sort of openly against open source. I think some organizations haven't thought through how they can benefit and are maybe resistant. I think we talk about Oracle and Microsoft as great examples. If you'd have wound back the clock 10 years ago, they would have said, and there's probably a Steve Ballmer video that we can go find, and a Larry Ellison video we could go find that says this is the Antichrist. You should never go and look at open source. You wind forward 10 years, Oracle Autonomous Linux, Java, one of my colleagues just wrote a piece around the interaction and some of the APIs they've done into MongoDB. You go and look at the points we talked about with Microsoft and more in Linux on Azure. I think if you'd have said those to sort of Ballmer and Ellison 10 years ago, they'd have laughed you out of the room. And so I think there's companies that are slower on that adoption and evolution curve for sure. but I think everybody knows that's where they're going to end up eventually.
Right.
So I think it'd be hard to be completely against open source. Now, how much does Oracle and Microsoft and some of these people who sort of get disrupted by it really like it? I don't. They're not going to tell me, and they're probably not going to put that in the press. But I think everybody's got to embrace it somehow, some way, and they're going through that evolutionary adoption curve.
So just like we have companies settling on this idea of hybrid clouds, you're going to use multiple cloud vendors, and you're going to have on-premise stuff in a data center. We're seeing that where companies are just, whether it's the developers themselves, again, we focus on Microsoft and Oracle, but others as well. There'll be a hodgepodge of some of the stuff will be proprietary, and they're going to develop that as much as they can and monetize that. And some of it will be open source, and they're going to try to be the number one open source support subscription provider in those areas.
Well, you look at somebody like an IBM; they're a classic example. They spent 34 billion acquiring Red Hat and all of its. Somebody joked at the time that IBM spent 34 billion to buy 0 IP assets. And technically, that's correct. There's no intellectual property within Red Hat. They don't own anything, but they've obviously built a fantastic subscription and support business that was, I think, 3.5 billion of annual turnover when IBM bought them, and that's been growing at about 20% year on year without having any intellectual property underneath it. So, to say, I think this, and you look at MongoDB, they're a publicly listed company. There's money. SUSE just went publicly listed last year. There's money and significant money in open source. It's just how that model's evolving.
Right. I remember when Oracle bought Sun, and they were talking about the value of Sun, they sort of got this thing called Java without spending any money on it. Right. The money that they paid for Sun was for things that Sun was already making money on, their hardware and Solaris and all that, not for Java, because Sun gave that away for free. Right. So you think about all the money for nothing, almost the opposite of the IBM, right? They spent $34 billion. Oracle spent some money, I think it's $8 billion for Sun, but probably zero of that $8 billion was for Java. They just got that sort of as a bonus, which turned out to be pretty wide. They do great acquisitions for Oracle. So, we've got one other, Pedro Andrade. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. I think you touched a little bit of some, Stephen. Enterprise open source goes well beyond support. It provides an optimized version of the software itself, features around security, performance. And I think you talked about that a little bit, whether it's Enterprise DB or Red Hat or whoever, right? They're also enhancing the product and giving their version, which they think is better than the others.
Yeah, it's the ability to. So they'll typically take there'll be a flywheel of open source. The Linux kernel is probably the fastest evolving piece. And then what Red Hat will do is flow that, as an example, through Fedora into streams and then into RHEL. That's the kind of, and by the time it's got to RHEL, it's tested. It's been security checked. There's a support contract for it. There's an implementation package so that it's easy to install. It works with Ansible. It works with OpenShift. It works with hundreds of other products. It's been certified on hundreds of different chip architectures and different server platforms. So if you buy a HP DL380 Gen 10 server from HPE and you want to run Red Hat Enterprise Linux version 8 on it, that those two vendors collaborated and did extensive testing. So that's what you're paying for. Yes, maybe you could run Fedora on that Gen 10 box from HPE. Maybe it works. Does it work with all the drivers and all the disks and all the subsystems? And is it fully integrated with all of HPE's management tools? Probably not. Absolutely it is, because from a RHEL point of view, because Red Hat's put that on the box as a supported platform, HPE says this version of the operating system runs on our hardware. So you're getting all the benefit of all that testing. And I know from an IBM point of view, there's a significant amount of work that both IBM and Red Hat put into that to make sure that this version of this box works with that version of an operating system. So
Right.
that takes time, it takes effort, it takes investment from both parties. Somebody's got to run a partner program, and somebody's got to run a joint development roadmap, and that's what you're fundamentally paying for. The fact that it works sounds a very high level topic, but there's a significant amount of work and effort that goes into that from both parties, whether
Right.
that's all of the original equipment manufacturer hardware and all the software companies. So you want to go and buy Oracle to run on HP hardware to run RHEL. Red Hat's worked with Oracle to make sure that the database is certified and everything works, and it's also worked with HPE to make sure that the hardware works. They've worked north and south of that equation to make sure that it's all tested. So if you take the latest version of Oracle, you run it on the latest version of RHEL, you put it on the latest version of HPE hardware, it'll all work. That sounds a relatively easy thing. It's not.
No. I mean, just and one of those pieces of the puzzle has an update, and it could mess everything. I mean, how many times have you updated your desktop and now an application doesn't work? I mean, imagine an enterprise with so much more complexity. It's crazy.
And that's what you're paying for fundamentally when you buy your RHEL subscription from Red Hat. You're paying for them to have done that work for you. Yes, you could do it yourself on Fedora, but do you want to? Do you want to basically try and copy the work that Red Hat is doing in that space? I don't think as a bank or a telco or a retailer you want to get into that space at all.
And it's not just those large companies. We a couple of years ago rolled out an education program where our customers can sign up and take classes on using Oracle, and we had to choose. There's a standardized platform on how, and it's called license learning management systems, LMS, just like LMS Oracle. But there's a standard platform. It's an open source platform, and you could go to a company and get a subscription and use their version of that platform where they work through all that. Or you could just download the code and put it on your own website and implement that. And we've done both, right? And I will tell you, it's a lot easier to pay someone else to do it than to do it yourself. Now, sometimes that's not worth it, and you want to do it yourself for other reasons. But it is a decision to make. I think every time we look at something, even a little Palisade company, whether it's a CRM application or a learning management tool or an email client, there's always an open source version of something, and there's always that where you can literally download the code and do it yourself. Then there's an open source version where someone is selling a subscription. They're doing all that hard, heavy lifting. And then you can buy something proprietary, right? You sort of have these multiple choices now, which you just didn't have before. At least I don't think you had them before. And you just need to go through that thought process. Is this worth it? Is giving this person that money worth it? Or is me having to do that work, is that taking away from my core value of what I provide to my clients? Or is this important enough that I should spend my time on it? And I would imagine if we're thinking about that in our little company, this has got to be something that huge enterprises are faced with every day.
And that's where the open source program office kind of plays the role. They should be your experts to help you think through that as an organization. So if you're a JP Morgan or a Wells Fargo or a Citibank, and you've got thousands upon thousands of developers, putting 5 or 6 people into an open source program office and making sure that they're experts in how open source is licensed and some of the implications, and whether those developers, you want them contributing to open source projects on their spare time, and what that means from an intellectual property point of view, and how you're going to change your employment contract for people to submit free code into a free community and think through that. I think that's the type of work that these big organizations, and arguably smaller organizations, if they're using more open source, should just be thinking about. If you've got 2,000 developers, putting 3 and 4 people into an open source program office sounds
Right.
like a good use of your time. And that's what I'm thinking. Whether it is that ratio or not, you should be thinking about how you staff up for this different landscape is all.
Well, in the last week, I've become the Palisade open source program manager. So it's fallen on me. I got a raise for that, but that's okay. And
Well, I think Craig should have looked after Craig in that situation.
right. So I would think that that program office, though, needs to be they just can't be put in place and say, okay, go to them if you have a question. They need to be very I hate to use the word proactive, but they need to take the initiative, because developers are going to develop and DBAs are going to DBA, and you're going to have people. We used to build stuff when I was at Oracle. I had my own little technical team that we hired because we couldn't get the IT team to move fast enough. So a skunkworks program team. And I think even in our client base, we see that all the time, is where there's these little pockets of development everywhere. And when you start really digging into where, again, Java is being used, people are shocked at every place where they're finding open source. They just had no idea. And hopefully a program office like that would find that out before a vendor knocks on your door.
Well, I think it's training, enablement, terms and conditions of employment, how people get onboarded, some of the choice of tools and development environments. An open source program office should be probably reporting into that head of development type role,
Mm-hmm.
and really guide. This isn't software procurement under a different name. This is, how do you train your developers? What terms and conditions do they work under? What tools do they use to do their job? Is there a developer advocacy and outreach program into some of those communities? How do you structure your role to work with, the downstream communities where the code's ultimately being developed?
Mm-hmm.
How are you brokering links between those communities and your employees? It's a very, very broad landscape. And I know certainly Red Hat guiding some of their clients on how to set up these open source program offices. I'm sure others are doing the same. I know, for instance, that the Linux Foundation does a lot of consulting and advisory to, so if you were Citibank and you wanted to set up one of these program offices, there's places you could go to get that type of help and guidance around what you should be thinking about.
Right, right. And just to backtrack a second, I know we're running on time here, but I did have one other comment talking about MySQL or MySQL, saying how they haven't changed under Oracle, and the community and the users are in fact benefited. And I'm sure there are many benefits. I'm not going to say it hasn't changed. I think the specter of having Oracle there makes it a little different for those clients, but I think he's right, where that's a great place where innovation happens, right? Is that these companies, these larger companies, can invest and coordinate, like you were saying before, and really push these products forward. Whereas, smaller, even if it's a crowdsourced group of community, that might not be able to do that. They might not have the financial resources to do that, because when you're a big company, you can all say march this way, and everybody marches that way.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these organizations, Oracle, IBM, Microsoft, Intel, Qualcomm, they'll be pointing significant volumes of their staff towards contributing to open source projects without a direct line of sight of how they're going to monetize it. So IBM's got thousands of developers contributing to open source projects. Microsoft would be the same. HPE, Dell, Cisco, Rackspace, all of these organizations over the years have contributed huge amounts to open source without, as I say, a direct line of sight of, oh, we've contributed this, therefore we're going to get this money back in return. And that's what you benefit from. But those organizations have got structures around how they contribute to open source, and customers need to be thinking about how they're consuming open source.
Right, right. Well, Stephen, this has been a great discussion, and I know we're just about out of time here. If there's one thing you want folks to take away from in this discussion, if you were heading up a large organization and you knew open source was there, what's one thing you'd want them to know, or what's one thing that you would do if you were heading up a large, say, technology provider?
I think this open source program office. Go spend some time with the Linux Foundation or a Red Hat or whoever you work with most in that space, and go and learn this discipline and go and be aware of how this is going to change your operations and how you work. As I say, I don't say this from a bad place. I don't think it's bad that these things need to be taken on board. You just got to be aware. And it's, you don't know what you don't know until you go spend some time and research this and start to put some of those disciplines. And then if you've got hundreds or thousands of developers, go and think of, I don't know what the percentage I would advocate for, but some percentage of your staff to be in this open source program office and coordination type role. Whether that's 2 or 3 people to handle 2,000 developers, I don't know what the metric would be, whether it's part of somebody else's job, but certainly have somebody who takes that sort of leadership role for that program office and thinks through some of those items. So that's, I suppose, what my advice would be.
And if someone was going in that direction, is that something you can help them with to think through all those issues?
Not something typically we do. I would suggest starting with the Linux Foundation. There's not going to be any charges if you go there. They're a not-for-profit organization. I know, for instance, the team at Red Hat, because I got briefed by these guys, so if you've got a number of Red Hat products, they'll spend some time with you in this space, and it's not an instantly chargeable activity. So I don't think there's many people out trying to monetize this advice, because it's just good housekeeping and good practice.
Mm-hmm.
And I think people are trying to add value. But I'd probably start at the Linux Foundation and type in open source program office, into Google as a term. Go start there, and if you're landing on the Linux Foundation's page, and maybe, Craig, I'll try and find some of the links so that we can put this into the LinkedIn chat afterwards, and you can put them on the YouTube channel or wherever else this lives. That's where I'd probably start.
This is going to live everywhere. This is going to be. This is going in the metaverse. Everyone is going to be watching this for years to come. Let me tell you.
That's a scary thought, right? That is a scary thought.
You and I will die one day, but this video will go on forever.
Yeah.
Our kids will be watching this. Well, Stephen, thank you so much for your time today. If someone wants to get in touch with you about the services that you provide, what is the best way for them to do that?
Probably LinkedIn or Twitter. I'm probably one of the most contactable people out there so at Stephen Dickens 3 on Twitter. More than happy if you want to message me on LinkedIn. Probably shouldn't give my corporate email address out, but more than happy for people to reach out on the social platforms. And, if you know Craig, but you don't want to, Craig knows where I am and can certainly get to me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If anybody needs to get in touch with Stephen or wants some more information on the work that he does, like he said, you can reach out to him directly on LinkedIn right here on this platform, or just reach out to me and I'll connect you all. So anyway, thank you very much, Stephen, for your time. I really do appreciate it. This was a great conversation. Like I said, at the very beginning, open source is, everyone's asking us about it. It's on the top of everyone's mind. They think it's a big risk. They think it's an opportunity. They're confused. They're excited about it. So there's all of that sort of rolled into this. And I think it's a really great opportunity for companies to get some new ideas and sort of leverage with traditional technology vendors and sort of build platforms that are forward facing, maybe not backwards facing. So thanks for all the insight that you gave us today. We really appreciate it.
A pleasure, Craig.
And thanks everybody for joining us today. We will see you next month. We're having another Palisade only webinar. We're going to have our panel discussion and we'll be talking about everything Oracle and their Q4. So We will see you all in March, everybody. Have a great day. Bye, everyone.